Welcome to the Stepfamily Saturday Series with your Stepfamily guides. We are here to lead you through the everyday challenges of your stepfamily journey. I'm Adrienne, and with me are my stepfamily guides, Amelia and Amy. Hi, ladies.
Hello again.
We are back for the fourth and final Stepfamily Mythbusters episode. So I don't know if I'm excited or sad about that, but I am excited to dive into this myth. The name unites the family, or one name is best. Very often we hear the thought process that one name equals one family. And while that is the tradition in nuclear families, that's not the case with blended and step families, and that's okay. While it's easy to get caught up in the emotions and societal standards that exist around the idea of what a family is, this can be dangerous territory. And I'm sure I can speak for all of us when I say there are many different ways to define what or who makes a family. So why don't we start there? Why do you guys think that the name is so important to some? Why do some get so caught up in wanting everyone in the family to have the same name?
I think, like you mentioned in the intro, there is the society's, expectations and society's views, right? And what we've grown up thinking is, everyone has the same last name in my family. And so when you're a family that there's a few different last names flying around, you start to think, oh, we're not really, I guess we're not really a family. And that really does affect kids too. There's a lot of kids get asked, well, why don't you have the same last name, right? And because they're curious, that's kids, right? And they're also growing up thinking that. So another reason why these are important conversations.
Absolutely. And that touches on another element of, traditionally, when you get married, you have the option to change your last name. The female typically does, not always. And, today we see many variations of that. Do you change it? Do you keep it? Do you hyphenate it? And that is different for everybody. But there's also so many elements to that. Do you talk to the ex about that? Do you make the decision on your own? Does your new partner have a say in it? And then do the kids get a say in any of it? Are their feelings considered? So let's talk more about some of those different aspects of it.
I think going into the whole we're going to get married now thing, we have to have those conversations of, what is going to define our family? Is it a name? Is it, how we interact with each other, things like that. I think for kids sometimes, especially now, my kids came from a nuclear family. I came from a nuclear family, excuse me. But when they were going to school, they had friends who had different last names that were step siblings. And it was, and at the time this was kind of new and different. So, the schools were trying to manage, like, so are you the mom? Are you the stepmom? Are you, nowadays, half of all families are step families. So it's not as, different. But I think you need to define what's going to identify you as a family. Is it the name? Is it really the name? I think some kids don't want to change their name. It's like, well, this is the name I was, given at birth. It's just because you're marrying that person. It doesn't necessarily mean I want to identify with that person by changing my last name. And then does that mean that I don't love dad anymore because I'm changing my name to your new husband's name? Like, what is that? How does that make dad feel? That might be a loyalty issue for a child too. There's so many, we could mind map this thing 100 different directions.
Right. Well, and unless we're talking about a situation where there was a loss of one of the parents, I mean, there's legalities involved. You can't just go changing children's last names. You have to have parental consent from both sides, and that's not likely. That's not very common. There are situations where it does happen and it does make sense, but that's not necessarily the norm either, which is partly why we end up with so many different names, right? We have bio dad's name, which the kids are traditionally named after, bio mom's name. If she remarries, she might take a different name or hyphenate. And then there's all the feelings of another woman having your current spouse's last name that we could get into. I know we've spent hours behind the scenes talking about this one.
You know what? I'm just going to talk about it because I think it's an important conversation to have. And I think that I am not the only one that's ever had these feelings. And so let's talk about it. My husband's ex has his last name, and it made me really uncomfortable for a long, long time. Up until, I mean, it wasn't that long ago we had this conversation, but Adrian, you gave me a completely different aspect when looking at it, because I was just very bothered for, well, a lot of years that why is she not changing her last name? Like, come on. That was how I viewed it. But in having the conversation, Adrian, you brought up the point of like, well, it's her daughter's last name, and her daughter's still young. And, you know, we're sitting here talking about what makes a family. Well, maybe she wants to keep that last name because her daughter identifies with that name, and, you know, it brings her daughter comfort, and that's okay. I mean, does it, at the end of the day, does her last name really affect my marriage? Does it really affect how, you know, my family functions? No. So I think it's important to talk about, because I know that this is a common issue. I know that people don't talk about it.
Yeah, well, and it's scary to talk about it, right? Because it involves and brings up so many emotions and different feelings for a whole host of different reasons. And there's the emotional side of those decisions, and then there's the legal side of those decisions. You know, for me, much to my husband's dismay at times, I hyphenated. I kept my ex's last name, and because our children were young when we separated. And there is also the legality side of dealing with the schools and the paperwork and the medical side of things, that there is also a simplicity to just having the same last name and not always having to explain over and over to everybody, schools, doctors' offices, you name it. And then I hyphenated, and I have my husband's last name as well. And that's typically what I use on almost everything, unless it's involving the kids. And it wasn't until we had our conversation that I ever even considered, oh, does this bother my ex's wife? I mean, it has never come up in our conversations, and we've had years of a great relationship, but I never even considered it. It was, in my mind, it was my decision. It was my name, and it was about what's best for my situation. But it wasn't until I heard your point of view, Amelia, that I went, oh, maybe I should have put some thought into that, or maybe that would have been a worthwhile conversation to say, hey, by the way, just so you know that I did this solely based on these reasons. It's not an attack at you. It's not a slight at you. It's not anything to do with you, quite frankly. But just so you know, I don't want you to sit around if this is something that bothers you. And if it is something that bothers you, that's okay. There's no judgment there. I get it. We all have feelings, and we all have things that come up.
And I think when we were talking about this originally, I had brought up to you that a friend had hosted some party for something, and there was an order form involved. And that's when I happened to see that my husband's ex was still using that name. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. And it was my friend that brought it up, that, oh, why is she using that last name? Until then, I didn't know, I didn't care, it didn't bother me, but it was when someone brought it up to me. So I think again, maybe looking at outside factors affecting your thoughts and whatnot about things, like maybe taking out what other people think and just worry about how do you actually feel about it. Because before that, I didn't feel anything about it. It didn't really matter.
Yeah. And back to Amy, your point, you know, it's kind of diving deeper and saying not just how do I feel about it, but why do I feel that way? And does this really matter? Like, is this the hill I want to die on? Is this the battle I want to fight? For what reason? What purpose? Because I'm worried what others are going to say. We shouldn't make our decisions based on that.
I had a stepmom that I worked with a while back, and she, of course, took on her husband's name. And then she said, sometimes I feel like his family sees me as 2.0, you know, like, because she's the second one to have that name and the second one to, you know, do the wife role. And she said, I sometimes feel like I'm second best because I'm always being compared to the first one. And you know, she said, so sometimes I regret taking his last name, because now I feel like I'm always being compared to the first, you know, the shiny first version of what that was supposed to be. And now I come along and I'm like the replacement. There's of course a lot of family dynamics going on with that too. But she said, you know, I just sometimes felt like I was version 2.0, but not in a good way, you know, from his side of the family. So that's hard too, you know. And there's so, and we talk about this, I think, with every episode. There's so much judgment from outsiders on what you're doing and what choices you're making. And you really need to kind of buckle it down into what's best for our relationship, what's best for the kids. But yeah, there's a lot of judgment around if you take the name, if you don't take the name. Like, everybody's got an opinion no matter which way you go with it, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think if we could give a standard PSA to the world, it would be something along the lines of, please stop labeling and judging. Please start allowing people to be their own unique individual and make decisions for themselves. I mean, we could
Yeah.
probably have a laundry list to add to that PSA because it is so frequent, especially, you know, if you don't live in a blended or step family and you haven't been through the daily challenges and the ups and downs and the roller coaster ride that it can be, it's hard to understand it, right? It's hard to understand anything that we haven't personally been through. We could name any topic. If you haven't dealt with a loved one who's had cancer, it's hard to understand. You can't put yourself in those shoes. And I think that's really what's behind most of our messaging, especially with these myths, is please, you know, think about how it would feel if the tables were turned or if you were in that situation. And even if you don't have first direct hand experience, have some empathy for those that are going through it, because I guarantee there isn't a person on this earth who isn't going through something, and that's what you would want in return. So any other suggestions, tips, tricks on how to navigate the whole topic of name change or defining what a family is, and that it doesn't have to be based on a last name?
Yeah,
No.
I think that's it. You know, your family doesn't have to be defined by what's at the end of your name, and make it about something else, and shift your focus, right? What you focus on is what, you know, you're going to make it into a bigger issue. So
Absolutely.
but also allow your children to talk about that if that's, you know, an issue for them. Don't not discuss it, but don't make that the focus.
Well, and maybe make sure that, you know, it is common, as Amy said, for children to question. So when kids go to school, it's, oh, why do you have a different last name? Or how can you be siblings? You don't have the same last name. I know my kids have experienced that, but because we talked openly about it, they were armed with responses, so they didn't feel as caught off guard. So I think, you know, going back to that open communication and not letting it be taboo and not talk about it within your family is so important.
Yeah, even, again, this is a little off topic, but having conversations with kids, like even for my son being young, you know, being questioned by his friends, well, why doesn't your sister live at your house? Why does your sister have another mom? And learning to teach kids how to have those conversations so that they don't have to be uncomfortable at school, and they can help their friends to understand. Because, yeah, again, schools, or at least here anyways, don't do a fantastic job at teaching kids about step and blended families. So we do have to arm our kids with how to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad we had this conversation. And this wraps up our Step Family Mythbusters, although I have a feeling we have more myths to bust. So I'm sure this will come back in the future. Thank you all for listening in, and we hope you will continue to do so each and every Saturday, whether you watch through YouTube at the Step Family Guides or on our website at thestepfamilyguides.com. We hope that this has been informative, and we look forward to hearing more of your questions so that we can bring you answers. Have a beautiful day.